In this section, I will show you how to make all of the adjustments to the pattern so that I can cut the fabric and sew the blouse. First, I want to go over the markings I made while the model was wearing this garment so I can be sure to recognize them. With a contrasting color, I can mark the new lines for the darts as well as side seams. And when you see me put a little round circle, that means if I take this dart apart and then need to put it back together as a reference, I line up those little circles. The underarm seam, the side seam, was taken in a little bit more in the back than the front. I'm marking right along where the pins show how much to take in or where to shift things. The cross mark at the top shows where the dart stops. The same thing at the bottom of the dart. Marking the hemline. And marking the shoulder. Marking the new edge of the collar. And where it's sewn in to the neckline from the center front area to the shoulder seam. Now I'll remove the collar so I have better access for looking at the blouse body and then dealing with the collar separately. Marking the top of the slit area. If you use a cotton thread, a lightweight cotton thread, it's much easier to take this apart. If you use polyester thread, you may not be able to pull quickly so the fibers rip easily. You may have to pick all the stitches out individually. On a curved area like the neckline, I don't want to just pull the fibers apart, the two layers of fabric, because they're more likely to stretch. On a side seam, that's not usually a problem, or across the shoulder. If you're using a seam ripper, and I don't suggest doing this on your fashion fabric, and you want to slide it through, make sure the little ball is down. The little ball being down opens the layers of fabric so you don't, hopefully, create a rip. This cotton is sturdy enough that if I do pull the seams apart, as you saw me do just a minute ago, it's usually not a problem. I would never do this on a fine silk or a fabric that would easily mar. If when you pull the fabric like I am doing, it's difficult then don't pull it. You don't want to make the fabric warp or get out of its original shape. And now to press it flat. That's very important. Dressing the shoulder. I want to look at both shoulders. Morgan's pretty symmetrical. So I'm going to measure how much the new shoulder at the sleeve area is taken in, compare them. If your client is very asymmetrical, you have to do both sides independently. But I can do both of these the same, and it should be a really good fit. I'm drawing the new seam line. Marking the new armhole. And look how scooped out it is about midway down that armhole from the shoulder. Look at the shape of that. Everyone has a different shaped armhole. Blending it in to the underarm seam. Making the changes in the vertical darts. Marking the new hemline, and notice how it curves down from the side seam to the front. It drops about 3/4 of an inch, and again, that's because the bust lifts this area up. And notice also how I'm flipping that curve. If a person has a larger derriere, a behind, you do the same thing. Marking the new dart at the bust. The bottom line will be a little bit longer than the top line, so that will be rather eased in, and then when pressed it will not show. The easing won't show at all. And look again how I'm flipping these curves. It takes a while to get used to using your curves, but they're very helpful in getting the correct shape. Folding up the new bust dart. Correcting the side seam, and look how much I took in the waist. She's very shapely. She has a beautiful body. If I hadn't done this, though, you would not see her shape. It would just be kind of a big box of fabric on her. You can go about making these corrections two different ways. You could put the fabric on top of the paper and use your tracing wheel to make the changes, or you can do as I'm doing, which is putting the paper on top of the fabric. I can easily see through this tracing paper make all the necessary changes, correct the seams, the seam allowances, and the darts, anything that needs to be changed, to finalize the pattern. Marking the new hemline. Sometimes it's easier to just start with a new piece of paper, but this will give you a better ability to see exactly what changes are being made. The new shoulder line. Seam allowance. New notch at the shoulder line. Crossing out the old notch. Drawing in the new bust dart. Reminding myself that there will be ease there. Correcting the vertical darts. And again, the upper part of the dart is used with the curve going one way for about 1.5 inches, 2 inches down, and then I flip the curve. Crossing out the old dart line at the bust. I put these little red circles just because my eye goes to them quickly. It helps me to recognize something, or when I am working quickly, I don't have to take time to search for things. And writing the amount of the dartage. The entire intake of that dart at the side seam, the bust dart, is 3 inches. Adding to the hemline, because I lowered that front area, so from this new center front area at the hem, I'm dropping 2 inches for the hem allowance. Trimming off the excess at the shoulder so I have a new shoulder seam line and seam allowance. Look at the difference between this new armhole shape and the original one. It's much more scooped out, and it's her specific shape. Armholes are very important. Correcting the seam allowance. Extending the darts to the bottom of the hemline and hem allowance. And then addressing the slit. Because I've decided to put a slit in this, I want to extend that area so there's a nice amount of fabric to fold back and under. Marking more clearly the new side seam. And this area at the bottom was taken in about 1/4 inch, which means 1/2 inch on either side, which is a full inch in the body. Look at the difference in the shape. Creating the seam allowance that goes according to the new seam line down the side seam. Trimming off the excess paper So we have the new side seam and seam allowance, and now to deal with the slit. I want this to be about an inch. So it's going to come out right there. Also, I'm marking it about an inch above the opening so that there will be a nice amount of fold back fabric above the opening as well as all the way down. So there's a transition there from 3/4 of an inch to 1 inch. I started to erase that notch indicating the hem, but decided to leave it. Truing the new dart. The dart is folded down as it will be in fabric when it's pressed. And measuring the new armhole. Remember, when you measure on the seam line, not including any seam allowance. We'll see how this compares to the original armhole measurements. The original armhole measurement was 10. This one is 9 7/8 inches. And now to work with the back piece. Starting with the fisheye darts. If you remember, I had one large dart, and now I'm going to put 2 on either side of center back. Marking the center of the dart, and what I'm doing is measuring from the center back red line across to mark the center of the fisheye dart, closest to center back. That line is, of course, parallel to center back. The second dart is also parallel to center back. The second dart is a little bit shorter at the top, but ends at the same place in the hip area. Marking the waist intake on both darts. Correcting the shoulder line and the armhole. I'm comparing how much was taken in on each side, and one side was taken in a little bit more. Because Morgan is very symmetrical, I want these two to be the same. These two side seams to be taken in the same and shaped the same. So what I'm going to do is stack the fabrics, fold them perfectly along the center back, and pin on this side where the new side seam is. Pin right through those markings, which indicates where the new side seam will be. And on the other side, I'm going to mark between that straight pin and the marking on this side. I'm splitting the difference. Can you see that? Splitting the difference. And putting a little circle above the one I'm very happy with. This is a fabulous technique, which Adele Margolis taught me. Adele was a wonderful teacher that I had the great privilege of learning with in the 1970s. you may be familiar with her books. And now to correct the paper pattern to reflect the changes that have just been made. I'm going to correct both sides of this pattern. If you're a person who would like to only cut with the fabric on the fold, in other words, use half the pattern, then just create the half pattern. I often create a full pattern because in the future I may be dealing with checks, stripes, plaids, different things that require matching, and also grain lines that are difficult to work with. And by having the full pattern, I'm able to make garments that I feel are more accurately cut. Carefully lining the paper pattern on top of the muslin, matching the center back seams and stabilizing it as much as possible with straight pins. Marking the new seam line and dart in the shoulder, bringing that dart down a fraction because the shoulder was lifted. I still want that dart to be the same length. So I came down about another 1/4 of an inch from the original dart at the very bottom tip. Creating the new seam allowance. Marking in the armhole. Seam allowance around the armhole. The new fisheye darts. crossing out any markings that are no longer necessary so that it's not confusing later on. Folding and truing the shoulder dart. On the underneath side, the dart points toward the center back, just like you will press it when it's fabric, stabilizing it with a straight pin. And right where the dart line is, you can see it goes down a fraction, the line does. It creates a little point. So I need to straighten that and then create the new seam allowance. Before you cut, make sure that the straight pin is completely out of the way of the blade of your scissors. Otherwise, your scissors will be terribly damaged. New notches. Now what I'm going to do is pin the front bust dart shut. Align the front and the back together, and I'll be lining up the seam, not the seam allowances. The broken line on the back is my new seam line, and I will align the front seam line on top of that. This way I will have the same shape down the very edge of the pattern, so that the side seams are the same shapes. Being able to see through the tracing paper makes this very easy. Also, see how I'm correcting that underarm seam. Where my left thumb is, the two seams are on top of each other. I never mind my patterns being patched with paper. However, if I ever make patterns for someone, I trace everything off onto a new piece of paper so that it's a clean pattern. This is called a working pattern. One-inch fold under, and remeasuring the armhole. Ten and 5/8, so that's 1/4 of an inch less than the original armhole. And now I'm going to transfer all of the markings from the corrected side to the non-corrected side to have a full back pattern piece. I'll trim off all the excess, add where necessary, transfer all markings, and also use my tracing wheel for the darts. Using some padding so that I don't damage the table. A couple layers of fabric or oak tag or cardboard, anything to give you a little padding is fine. So this is the correct orientation of the fabric on top of the pattern. The fabric is laying across the fold line of the pattern. Marking the new changes with the tracing wheel. This is the new seam line for the neck. And this is the point of the collar at a completely different angle. Instead of going out, it will come in. Adding my seam allowances. Refreshing the notches. Now, while I'm cutting this one layer, I could have folded the entire pattern together and cut all 4 sides at once. Sometimes when you fold anything, it somewhat distorts the different layers. So by doing it this way, it's probably going to be a little more accurate. Reestablishing the notches. And now to work with the sleeve. While I could just correct the sleeve, I'm going to make a new sleeve pattern. I have a great deal of fun drafting sleeve patterns, and I find that I'm usually much more successful if I just start from scratch with the new measurements. So first I measured the general dimensions of the sleeve so that I could cut a piece of paper large enough. Reminding myself of the cap height of the original sleeve. Writing down the measurements of the new armhole shapes. And again, on the right, I write the front armhole measurement, and on the left, I write the back armhole measurement. I'm going to take those two measurements and add them together. You can locate them and add them on the tape measure. And you can also just write them down and divide by 3 to see what your cap height is. And you don't have to use this method as an unbroken rule. In time, I will teach you how to adjust cap heights for different reasons. However, this is a good standard method to start with. The cap height for this sleeve will be 6 1/4 inches. Starting with the shoulder line, coming down and marking a line parallel to the shoulder line, which is the bicep line, and this one again is 6 1/4 inches. Putting a notch at the top shoulder line, finding the front armhole measurement as it intersects the bicep line. These two measurements are almost exactly the same as the original sleeve measurements. Measuring the bicep line. Marking the depth of the sleeve cap. Finding the midpoint of each of the diagonal lines, coming down 1 inch and making a cross mark perpendicular to that line, which will be a notch. And on the back, you do the same. You come to the midpoint, come down 1 inch, and another 1/2 inch to have your 2 notches. Create your overarm curves and the underarm curves. And often the back overarm curve is a little wider than the front, and the underarm in the front, what I'm doing now, has a deeper curve than the one in the back. Think about how your arms move forward. They move forward more than they move back. So you need more room, more fabric in the back. By removing the seam allowance from the original sleeve pattern, I'd like to compare the two sleeves to see how the different measurements make the shapes so very different. As you can see, there's more width across the bicep, and in the cap of the sleeve, about midway down from the shoulder, there is also more width. This will give her much more room in the sleeve. Now to determine the length. The new sleeve can be the same length as the original. To create my grain line, I find the midpoint of the bicep and create a line perpendicular to the cross grain. Filling in the first fold line, which is also the bottom hem line, from the bicep down. Now I can take the original sleeve, align the grain lines down the center of the sleeve, and mark the mid-width to see how it will compare when this new sleeve is developed. I can also remind myself what the bottom width was because that was fine on the first blouse. 11 inches. 11 would be 5.5 inches on either side of the grain line. Cutting off the seam allowance will help me to also compare the two sleeves. While I have the sleeves aligned, look again at the cap and the bicep to see the changes. And now using the original without seam allowance, I can use that as a template to create the shape for the cuff and hemline. I'm placing the ruler 3/4 of an inch away from the base of that sleeve. That will create the 3/4 inch seam allowance. And connecting it, of course, to the bottom of the sleeve. And at the top of the cuff, I extend the pattern 1/8 of an inch. So the seam allowance is built in, and you can see at the very top of the ruler where the diagonal measurement line intersects the bicep. The seam allowance extends from there, 3/4 of an inch. Writing the measurement of the bicep. It's always a good idea to write these important measurements on your patterns for future reference. Indicating where the shoulder notch will be, and now measuring the sleeve front and back to compare with the armhole measurements. Remember, when you create a curve from the straight line, the curve is a longer measurement, allowing ease. So we have 1/2 of an inch ease, and that's from about where that little arrow is to the shoulder. Depending on the size of the person and the size of the pattern, I usually put the ease between 3 and 4 inches from the shoulder down the cap, measuring the back armhole, finished measurement, armhole measurement, and this also is 1/2 of an inch ease. So the whole sleeve from front to back is 1 inch. And filling in the seam allowances. On the first sleeve, I shaped from the underarm at the bicep to the bottom of the sleeve. I curved the underarm seam. On this one, I made it straight. That will allow more room in her elbow. Folding the sleeve in half and aligning the bicep and hem lines. And just extending all the notches to the edge of the seam allowance. Remember, they are squared up or perpendicular to the seam. And let's compare the two. Look at the cap again and the bicep, and look at the elbows. There's about almost 2 inches more space across the elbow area, and filling in what will be the slit. You'll enjoy watching how this is made. It's rather magical. Get rid of the old sleeve so I don't get them confused. Let's be sure to fill in the notches on the body. Excluding seam allowance, I measure from the underarm seam to the notch on the sleeve, and whatever that measurement is, I transfer that measurement to the body, measuring from the underarm seam up. And repeating the same process with the back. Measuring from the underarm to the first and second notch. And transferring those notches to the back armhole on the body. Putting little dots to remind myself that those are the correct notches, since this pattern has markings that are hard to erase or mark out completely. And now we have our basic pattern pieces: front, back, sleeve, and collar. On to creating our blouse.